I almost didn't go. The invitation sat on my kitchen counter for weeks, gathering dust beside unopened bills and cold coffee mugs. It was a plain white envelope, no warmth, no note, just the time, date, and location. A family reunion, they called it, as if the word family hadn't been sharpened into a blade and used on me too many times before. Still, something in me, some quiet part I'd kept hidden even from myself, wanted to walk in there just once, not as the girl they tore down, but as the woman I'd become. The moment I stepped out of the car, the air shifted. It was the same old backyard, the same drooping string lights, the same mismatched lawn chairs and paper plates stacked too high. Laughter echoed from somewhere inside the house, but it didn't reach the driveway. No one noticed I was there. No one rushed to greet me. And that was fine. I'd worn a simple black dress. Nothing flashy. No designer logos or labels to scream how far I'd come. My silence would speak louder. My presence alone, I thought, was already too much for them. And I was right. As I walked through the sliding doors into the living room, every head turned, but only for a second. Then came the whispers. My aunt pretended not to see me. My cousins gave me forced smiles, like they'd been practicing how to look neutral. My uncle, already halfway through his second beer, nodded once. Only my younger cousin, Lily, offered a genuine smile. She always had a softness others lacked. Then I saw him, my father, standing by the grill, spatula in hand like some badge of authority. His voice was loud, like always, booming over everyone else's. I waited for him to see me. He did. And for a second, just a flicker of a second, I saw something pass through his eyes. Not joy, not pain, just annoyance, like I was a commercial interrupting his show. "You came," he said, turning back to the grill. That was it. No hug. No, how are you? Just 3 syllables, tossed out like scraps to a stray dog. I stood there, hands lightly clasped in front of me, pretending his indifference didn't hurt. But it did. I'm not made of stone. I still wanted something from him. Maybe not love, but acknowledgement. Maybe not pride, but just decency. The reunion crawled forward. The same old stories got dragged out. My father retold the one where I'd cried during a school play, laughing as if it was still funny. My uncle bragged about his son's promotion. Never mind, it was at a firm I now own shares in. My name never came up. Not once. I sat there, sipping sparkling water, pretending I wasn't shrinking inside. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I reminded myself that I had survived worse than their silence. I had built a life on the ashes they left behind. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for just the right moment, my father turned toward the crowd and said it, loud enough for the music to quiet, clear enough for even the kids to hear. I'd rather be dead than call her my daughter. And just like that, the air vanished from the backyard. Someone gasped. My uncle froze mid-sip and spilled his drink onto his shoes. My aunt looked like she might faint. But me? I didn't flinch. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I had learned how to bleed, quietly. I didn't always know how to stay silent. As a child, I cried too easily, felt things too deeply, and asked too many questions that were answered with sighs or slaps of disappointment. My earliest memory of my father isn't a hug or a bedtime story. It's the sting of his voice calling me a burden. I must have been 6. I had brought home a crayon drawing from school, full of crooked hearts and stick figures labeled me and Dad. He barely glanced at it before tossing it aside with a grunt. "You think that's worth putting on the fridge?" That sentence etched itself into me. I never drew again. Growing up in that house meant learning how to make myself smaller every day. My brother got the praise, the attention, the space to mess up. I got lectures for being too quiet, too sensitive, too strange. I once overheard my father say to my mother, "She's not like us. I don't know where she came from." She didn't correct him. She never did. School became my escape. I poured everything into books, into getting good grades, into being invisible enough to avoid criticism, but impressive enough to maybe, just maybe, get a pat on the back. It never came. My report cards were perfect. My heart, not so much. I remember one evening, I was 13 and I had just won a science fair at school. I walked into the house, holding the blue ribbon, like a trophy. My mom was in the kitchen, my dad watching sports. I stood there, waiting for them to ask. They didn't. When I finally told him, he didn't even mute the TV. Cool. But your cousin got into a private school. That's a real achievement. That was the night I stopped waiting for applause. I began to understand that love in our home was conditional. My brother could mess up and still be their golden child. I could succeed, but it would never be enough. At 17, I got a scholarship to a university, 3 states away. My father's reaction? You sure you can handle that without falling apart? So I left with a suitcase and a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. But in my chest, something had shifted. I told myself I wouldn't need them to believe in me if I could believe in myself. Still, the wounds followed me. Every time I achieved something, my first job, my first promotion, I thought about calling home. I wanted them to know, to see, to finally say, we were wrong about you. But the silence was always louder than any imagined praise. And yet, I never let the bitterness consume me. I let it fuel me, quietly. I didn't throw tantrums or write angry letters. I simply kept going. That was my rebellion. That was my healing. I had survived them, and I had done it without becoming them. Now, standing in that backyard, with his cruel words still hanging in the air, I felt those old memories rise like ghosts. But they didn't haunt me the way they used to. They simply reminded me of the distance I'd traveled, and how far I'd risen without ever needing to scream. After I left home, there was no safety net. No calls to check if I had arrived. No text asking if I was settling in. I unpacked in a small dorm room that smelled like dust and old paperbacks, and I cried quietly into my pillow that first night, letting go of the hope that my parents might one day show up for me. But something happened in that solitude. In the stillness of being forgotten, I started remembering myself. I worked 2 jobs to keep that scholarship. Morning shifts at a campus cafe and night shifts cleaning labs. I barely slept, often skipping meals to make rent. But with every struggle, I felt something inside me hardening, not in a bitter way, but like steel being forged. I stopped apologizing for being different. I stopped looking over my shoulder for approval that would never come. College became my rebirth. I majored in finance, minored in computer science. Numbers made sense to me. They didn't lie. They didn't ask for my tears. They rewarded precision, discipline, and clarity, all things I had taught myself to survive. I graduated top of my class, not that my family ever showed up to the ceremony. I scanned the crowd anyway, half hoping, half hating that hope. I walked across that stage alone. But I walked. My first job was with a mid-sized tech firm. The pay was decent, the hours brutal. I was the youngest on my team, and I kept my head down, letting my work speak. It always did. I started automating processes no one else noticed, saving the company time and money. Promotions came fast. So did the whispers. Who is she? Where did she come from? I never answered. I let my silence speak the loudest. By 27, I had jumped to a startup that was about to implode. I took a risk, sunk everything I had into it. Time, money, sleepless nights. And when it finally rose from the ashes, it was me they credited. I didn't just climb the ladder. I rebuilt the building. And at 30, I bought my first company outright. I renamed it quietly. No fanfare. No public announcement. Just quiet satisfaction. The company my uncle worked for, that was the 3rd one I acquired. He had no idea, of course. I never changed my last name. I never sent an email from the CEO's desk. I hired a team I trusted and watched from the background, letting the weight of my decisions ripple through boardrooms and balance sheets. I didn't crave power, I just wanted peace. But when peace wasn't given to me, I built it from scratch. And still not a word from home. Every birthday passed with silence. Every holiday with absence. I sent gifts a few times, just to see. Nothing extravagant. Books, scarves, a handwritten card. I never got a thank you. Eventually, I stopped sending them. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. They had made their choice. And now I was making mine. I told myself if I ever saw them again, I'd be kind. Not because they deserved it, but because I did. That day at the reunion, when I stood there listening to my father spit venom, I realized something beautiful. All those years, I thought I was alone. I wasn't. I had me. And I had grown into someone I liked, someone calm, collected, whole. I didn't need to shout back at him. I didn't need to cry or crumble. I had already won. And he didn't even know it yet. The family reunion had been my uncle's idea. Let's bring everyone together again, he had said, with a voice full of forced cheer. It had been years since I saw most of them, and longer still since any of them asked how I was. But I agreed, not out of obligation, but because I was no longer afraid of who I might run into. I had spent years rebuilding myself. I could face old ghosts without shaking. The backyard was full of laughter and folding chairs, kids running with juice boxes, and the smell of overcooked burgers on the grill. It looked warm, familiar, but beneath it all was a tension that never quite left our gatherings. Everyone knew who was favored. Everyone knew who was left out. I was used to being that quiet shadow in the corner, the one people greeted with a polite smile and little else. My father stood near the drinks table, holding a beer, already on his second or third. He laughed too loudly, clapped backs too hard, still playing the role of the strong man, the head of the family. But the older he got, the more brittle that act became. He saw me across the yard and offered a nod that barely acknowledged my existence. That was our usual interaction. I didn't expect more. I had stopped expecting more a long time ago. But something in him that day was different. A bitterness. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the whisper he'd heard that I was doing well. That his daughter, the one he used to call weak, had become someone. We were all gathered around the long table, halfway through the meal when it happened. My uncle, slightly tipsy, said, "You know, it's good to see everyone doing so well. Even our little quiet girls, all grown up now." He didn't mean harm. In fact, it sounded like the first kind thing anyone had said to me in years. But my father scoffed, loud enough for everyone to hear. He put his glass down hard and said, "I'd rather be dead than call her my daughter." There was a stillness, a vacuum of sound. Chairs froze mid-scoot. Forks paused midair. The kids, thankfully, weren't close enough to hear. My uncle's hand trembled, and he spilled his drink on the tablecloth. My mother looked down, suddenly very interested in her plate. No one said anything, not even me. I just sat there, blinking slowly, breathing, letting the words settle, not because they surprised me, but because they didn't. Then he added, "You think you're so important just because you make more than me?" His voice cracked a little at the end, and that's when I understood. This wasn't just cruelty. This was envy. This was a man who once towered over me, now choking on his own resentment. And still I said nothing. I simply picked up my glass, took a slow sip, and looked him in the eye for the first time in years. He didn't like what he saw, because for the first time I wasn't looking for his approval. I was looking down at a man who had already lost me. The silence after his outburst was like a wound tearing open in the middle of that sunny backyard. I could feel everyone's discomfort hanging in the air, thick and heavy, like humidity before a storm. My father leaned back in his chair, smug, convinced he'd put me in my place once again. I think he expected me to excuse myself quietly, maybe cry in the bathroom like I used to when I was younger. But this time I didn't flinch. I didn't run. I stayed seated, breathing deeply, still calm. It wasn't just his words that stung. It was the way everyone else stayed silent. My cousins looked down. My aunt pretended to text. Even my mother, who should have spoken, sat there tracing the rim of her glass, refusing to meet my eyes. The girl who once begged to be seen had now become the woman they refused to look at. But I didn't need their eyes. I had found my strength in places they never bothered to explore. My uncle was the one who finally broke the silence, chuckling nervously as if to sweep the moment under the rug. "Come on, that's a bit much, isn't it? She's your daughter, for God's sake." That's when my father leaned forward, his voice sharper, laced with a bitterness he could no longer hide. "She thinks she's better than everyone." "What? Just because she makes more money? Has a fancy job? You don't disrespect your family like that. She didn't build anything without turning her back on us." I looked at him for a long time and then I smiled. A quiet, knowing smile. That was when I said, gently but clearly, "Actually, I own the company you work for." The words didn't need to be shouted. They didn't need to be dramatic. I said them like I was reading the weather forecast. Calm, factual, steady. At first he laughed. Then he stopped, because the silence didn't break the way he expected. My uncle's jaw tensed. My cousin froze with a fork halfway to her mouth. My father's face twisted, something between confusion and denial. "What did you just say?" he asked, voice a little weaker now. "I said I own the company you work for. I bought it 2 years ago." He blinked. I could see the fight draining out of him as reality began to settle. "You're lying," he said, but it didn't even sound convincing to himself. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small black folder I had brought, not to flaunt, but because I had a feeling I might need it. I placed it on the table. Inside were copies of the acquisition documents, my signature clean, and printed at the bottom, next to the company seal. I didn't pass it to him. I just let it sit there. He didn't open it. He didn't need to, because the truth was sitting right in front of him, and it was wearing a calm smile and a dress he once said made me look too ambitious. For the first time, he looked small. Not physically, but something in him folded. That iron control he used to rule the house with? It cracked. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list my achievements. I didn't throw back all the years of pain. I just looked at him like someone who had healed. Someone who didn't need revenge, but who was ready to let him see exactly what he lost. Because that was the moment everything changed. Not when I said it, but when he believed it. After I said those words, after I calmly placed the folder on the table and leaned back in my chair, there was no storm, no shouting, no apology, just silence. The kind of silence that makes people shift in their seats and look for exits in their minds. My father didn't touch the folder. He didn't speak. He just stared at it like it was a ghost. I wasn't there to humiliate him. That wasn't my intention. But I also wasn't going to protect his pride anymore. I had done that for too long, shielding him from the shame of the way he treated me, quietly swallowing the insults so that family dinners didn't get awkward. But in that moment, the truth sat on the table with more dignity than he ever gave me. My mother finally looked up. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time in years, she didn't look indifferent. She looked lost, like the version of me she had in her head had just vanished, replaced by someone she didn't recognize, someone stronger, someone she could no longer dismiss with a sigh. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I know," I replied. That was the problem. Across the table, one of my cousins, Rachel, smiled faintly. She had always been the one who asked how I was doing, even when no one else did. I saw something in her eyes that day. Not surprise, not shock, but something like pride, and maybe even hope. Because here's what happens when one person finally stands up. The others start to shift, too. My uncle cleared his throat, looking between me and my father. "Well," he muttered, "that explains why Steve's been getting those early morning review emails from corporate." I smiled at that, a small one. My father's jaw clenched. No one mocked him. No one defended me. But a quiet respect began to replace the judgment. I wasn't just the girl they barely acknowledged anymore. I was the woman who rose when she wasn't supposed to, who succeeded when she was expected to fail, who came to a family reunion not to gloat, but to simply exist with her full truth intact. And they saw it now. They felt it. I got up slowly and walked toward the drink table. I didn't rush. I didn't try to escape the attention. For once, I let myself be seen. Behind me, the conversations began to change. People talked lower, more thoughtfully. My name was said differently, not as a footnote, not as a joke, but as a realization. Something had shifted in the hierarchy of this family, and not because I claimed power, but because I no longer hid who I was. My father remained seated, staring at the folder he never opened. Maybe he was still trying to process the reality that the daughter he called worthless now held the pen that signed his checks. He had built his identity on being above me, and now that illusion was shattered. But I didn't feel satisfaction. What I felt was peace, because I hadn't destroyed him. I had simply revealed myself. And once I did, the ripple moved through every branch of that family tree. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. And honesty, when it finally arrives, echoes longer than any scream. The rest of the reunion carried on, but it wasn't the same. Laughter felt forced. Conversations were careful. Every now and then, someone would glance my way, as if trying to reconcile the version of me they thought they knew with the woman standing in front of them now. I didn't feel like the outsider anymore. I felt untouchable, not because of money, not because of power, but because I finally stopped needing their approval. That realization was the most freeing part of all. I walked around the backyard, greeting cousins, smiling politely, asking about their lives. I didn't mention the folder again. I didn't bring up the company. I didn't say another word to my father. I didn't need to. The truth had already done its work, quietly and completely. Anything more would have felt like rubbing salt into a wound, and I had no desire to wound him. All I ever wanted was respect. To be heard. To be acknowledged for who I was, not who they decided I should be. And I had given them the opportunity to do that once. Twice. 100 times. But today wasn't about giving them another chance. It was about finally giving myself one. As the afternoon sunlight dipped lower and painted golden shadows across the garden, I found myself standing near the rose bushes my grandmother had planted years ago. I used to play beside them as a child, making crowns out of fallen petals, while my father told me I'd never be anything unless I learned to listen. Back then, I believed him. But looking at those same bushes now, blooming stronger with each season, I realized something simple but powerful. Growth doesn't ask for permission. It just happens, even in hostile soil. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see my father approaching slowly. He looked tired, older than I remembered, like the weight of pride was finally starting to show in his posture. He stopped a few feet away, eyes flicking from my face to the ground. "You should have told me," he muttered. I held his gaze, calm and unwavering. "You wouldn't have listened." He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. He knew I was right. The silence between us stretched, filled with all the things that could have been said. Regrets, excuses, pain. But I didn't need to hear any of it. I didn't need his apology, because healing didn't mean making him understand. It meant I had finally understood myself. After a long pause, he whispered, "So what now?" I smiled faintly and said, "Now nothing. We live our lives." That was the closure. Not some emotional breakdown. Not some tearful reunion. Just the truth laid bare in the quiet. He wanted me to reach for him, to fix what he broke. But I had already done the hard part. I had repaired myself. I turned away, not out of cruelty, but out of peace. As I walked toward the exit, the breeze moved gently through my hair. I heard laughter again, this time from the kids playing near the patio, and it sounded more genuine than it had all day. Maybe because, somehow, they could sense the shift too, that something heavy had been lifted. I didn't look back, not because I was angry, but because I no longer needed to. Closure didn't come from what he said. It came from what I no longer needed him to say. As I stepped outside the house and into the quiet of the evening, I took a deep breath. The weight I'd carried for years, the weight of trying to please people who would never see me for who I truly was, finally lifted. The cool evening air felt like freedom. I could hear the sound of my heels clicking against the driveway, each step a marker of how far I had come from the girl who used to cower in the corner, waiting for someone, anyone, to make her feel like she mattered. The girl who once begged for love, for approval. The woman I had become didn't need anyone's validation. Not from my father, not from my mother, not from anyone at that reunion. The only person whose approval I needed now was my own. I paused at the gate, feeling the breeze against my skin, and looked up at the sky. The stars were just starting to appear, faint but steady in the darkening sky, and for a moment I remembered what it felt like to dream. The woman I had become wasn't just someone who had achieved success, who owned a company, or who had worked her way through endless struggles. She was someone who finally understood the importance of her own worth. I had spent so many years letting my father's voice define me. For years, I believed his words when he told me I was worthless. I internalized his cruelty and made it my truth. But standing there in the quiet of that evening, I realized that none of his opinions, none of his judgments, mattered anymore, because I had learned how to define myself. I glanced at my phone. There was a message from Rachel, one of my cousins who had been there earlier. "I'm proud of you. I know it wasn't easy, but you did it." The message was simple, but it held more weight than anything my father could have said. It was the validation I no longer needed from the people who had held me back. The acknowledgement from someone who had quietly watched me grow, even when I was too lost to see it myself. The driveway stretched ahead, leading to my car. I didn't rush. I had no reason to hurry anymore. My life was finally on my terms. My success was mine, not to flaunt, but to stand in quietly and confidently. No more apologies. No more excuses. Just peace. As I reached my car and opened the door, I felt something deep inside me shift. For the first time in my life, I understood that revenge wasn't about proving someone wrong. It wasn't about making them suffer for the way they treated you. It was about healing yourself in ways they would never understand. It was about walking away with your head high, knowing you had nothing left to prove. Not to them. Not to anyone. I started the engine and drove away from that house, leaving behind the people who would always view me as lesser. But in that moment, I knew that I had already won. As I drove through the quiet streets, the weight in my chest was gone, replaced by the quiet power of knowing who I was. The woman who had once been nothing in their eyes was now someone who had everything she needed. Not wealth, not approval, but her own respect, her own dignity. And that was enough. In the rear-view mirror, the house where I had once felt small began to fade into the distance. A chapter had closed. A new one had begun. And this time, I wasn't walking away broken. I was walking away whole.